Thank you. Good evening,
Setting everything
everyone.
up, and thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, welcome, welcome. I think I don't know who, there are some new people. So just a brief introductions about AB. We are not-for-profit organization formed by a group of Buddhist practitioners and supported by an ordained Sangha as our spiritual director with Teacher Damo. So we organize regular Thursday talks, meditation practice, and meditation retreats. And we have a beautiful retreat center at the Southern Highland called Vejasala. And we recently just have our Easter retreat there. And this is taken during the retreat. Can you see the kangaroo behind the Buddha statue there? So yeah, it was just taken recently. All right. About Sue. Many of you know Sue, but in case some of you that haven't known Sue, I want to introduce Sue to you. Sue Toohey, our teacher for tonight. Sue is one of our founding member of the Associations of Engaged Buddhists. He has contributed enormously to the association for so many years. And Sue is a former university teacher in the School of Public Health at UNSW. And Sue has been a Buddhist practitioner for more than 30 years and an experienced yoga teacher qualified in both Hatha and Dhru style of yoga. And she used to teach a range of weekly yoga classes in Sydney in the West. But what I like most about Sue is she is so knowledgeable and yet very humble. She has this presence that is very comforting, and she's somebody that you will feel very safe and very comfortable to be with. So tonight, Sue
Thank
will
you, Meredith.
explore with us. Sue will explore with us what it means to accept the idea of no permanent self and how that might lead to our greater freedom and happiness. Can't wait to hear from Sue. Over to you, Sue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, everyone. Well, I call this talk the shape-shifting self because many, many years ago, when I started out life as a librarian, I had done my master's in library science, and part of it was in I got to specialize in an area of literature that I was interested in, and so the area I chose was folklore. And the shapeshifter appears in folklore from a whole lot of different, wildly different cultures. There are shapeshifters in Celtic mythology and in Scandinavian mythology and in Italian folk stories and in Navajo folk stories. Shapeshifters are everywhere. They're very often women, because we all know that women can't be trusted and they can change their shape, you know, to trick men. So often the shapeshifters are women, and when they're not women, they're magicians and sorcerers and, you know, shamans, and they practice their magic, and then they just slip away disguised as a cat or a wolf into some other place. So I always liked the idea of shapeshifters, and I thought it's not very different from the way that the Buddha sometimes talks about the self as being in a continual state of flux and change. So I keep coming back to talk about not self because I find it one of the most interesting aspects of the Buddha's teaching. And in fact, several people say that it is the most defining aspect of his teaching. It is the one thing that stands out from all the other religions in the world, is this concept of not self, no permanent self, no soul that goes on forever and ever. And his face is both interesting and very difficult to grasp. And it certainly took me a lot. At the beginning, I thought, well, I can understand. I started looking into Buddhism when I was a teenager, And I thought, I can understand impermanence and I can understand suffering and dissatisfaction. And I just really don't have a clue about what not self means, but I'm just going to put that to one side and maybe, you know, I'll get a better idea over time. And that is what happened. But I think even more difficult to grasp, apart from the idea of non-self, is how it would actually make us happier to believe this. If we look at other religions teach meditation. It's a part of Christianity. It's a very strong part of the Quakers in Protestantism, in Christianity, and it's also a part of many Catholic monastic practices. So Buddhism hasn't got meditation to itself. It's always been a very strong part of Hinduism. And I first learned meditation from my yoga teachers when I was in my 20s. And I was interested in meditation because I suffered a lot of migraine in those days, and I really hoped that meditation would help. And we did a couple of different kinds of meditation practices. In yoga, we did the yoga nidra, the conscious relaxation of the body, which is not very different from the body scan in Buddhist meditation. And then we would do visualizations of pleasant, relaxing places that were supposed to, you know, make us feel more peaceful and relieve stress. And I found that kind of meditation mildly useful, but certainly not transformative. It was a bit like a Band-Aid. You know, you have a really bad day at work, you come home, you do your relaxation, you relax a bit, you feel a bit better, and then you can all set to go back and repeat the same thing the next day. So it didn't, for me, lead to any long-lasting change. And then compassion and kindness, which are central to the Buddha's teaching, they certainly didn't appear much in the Old Testament of Christianity and in Judaism at that time. But by the time that Jesus Christ comes on the scene, the idea of compassion and kindness become absolutely central to his teaching, which was radical for his time. So much so that the Indonesian Buddhists told me this. They gave me a DVD of this documentary that had been made, which suggested that for those years when Jesus was a young adult, before he became known as a teacher, that he might have actually gone to and studied with the sages in India and brought back the idea of loving kindness and compassion from them. But anyway, it's certainly a feature of the best kinds of Christianity. And then all religions have their codes of ethical behaviour, and they vary a bit, but essentially, you know, a lot of it is the same. So what is it about the Buddha's teaching that draws us here rather than to a Hindu temple or a Christian church? The Buddha says that there are three things that are unique to his teaching, and they are anicca, impermanence, anatta, the doctrine of no permanent self, and dukkha, the idea that we are all dissatisfied a lot of the time with the way our lives are going or with certain aspects of it. So we see impermanence constantly before us. It's not hard to accept impermanence, or at least it's not hard to see that it exists. We might have a hard time accepting that we and our loved ones are just as subject to impermanence as anyone else in the world, but at least on a superficial level, we have to admit that impermanence is real. And dissatisfaction is pretty evident too. Sure, we have good times when everything goes well, but it doesn't take long before the hangover follows the party and we're back to being dissatisfied again. But not self is on another plane altogether, I reckon, because the self seems so real to us. We have a pretty clear idea of who we are and what kind of person we are. And it seems to us that this person continues along throughout life. So what does the idea of not self mean, and how could it be liberating? How could it contribute to our happiness? The Buddha, who among his many titles was sometimes called the analyzer, excuse me, I've been croaking away all day. He was interested in this idea, which was around it in his day, of the Atman, or the permanent self, the soul that went from one existence to another. And he was using his meditation to think about where in the human being could the Atman be found, the soul or the self. And he decided that you could consider the human being as being made up of 5 kinds of processes, groups of like things that could be considered, each of them could be considered as one aspect of the human being. And so he went through each of them one at a time, thinking, is this where we could find the Atman, the soul? The first one is the material form, or the body. All the physical processes of eating and growing and decaying and repairing that make up the physical body. Now, anyone can see that there's nothing very permanent about the body. It's in a process of change from the moment we're born to the moment we die. So he discarded the body as being the home of the soul. And he went on to the next group, which is feelings or sensations, both sensations in the body and the responses that we have to them, such as liking or disliking or not caring about them one way or the other. And even all of us, unenlightened though we might be, can see that our feelings and our likes and our dislikes change from moment to moment. So there's no lasting self or soul to be found there. The third group is perception. All the input from our various senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes. And again, we can see that perception's changeable and not to be relied on. I have to tell you a little story here that happened 2 days ago. It was early in the morning and my husband and I both woke up at the same time, and it was earlier than we usually wake up. It was about 6 o'clock. Light was just starting to come in through the curtains, but it was pretty dark in the room. And he said, you know, shall I get up and make some tea? And I said, yes, please. And he got up and he went to open the curtains and let more light in. And at that moment I said, stop, wait. I can see through the curtains. And there's a great big cockroach clinging to the other side of the curtain. It was like a big one about this long. And I said, don't move the curtain or that cockroach is going to fly into the room. It must have flown in through the window during the night. And now it's clinging to the other side of the curtain. And my husband is a bigger wimp about cockroaches than I am. So he said, well, have we got any insect spray? And I said, no, because we don't want to go around spraying poisonous sprays and breathing it in. So I said, why don't you go to the kitchen and get a tea towel And then you can just very carefully pull the curtain back. And with the tea towel over your hand, you can snatch the cockroach off and shake it out the window. And he said, no way am I touching that cockroach. So we had a little discussion about what sort of a man are you that you can't even get rid of a cockroach. And then he agreed that he would go to the kitchen and get the tea towel if I grabbed hold of the cockroach and got rid of it. So off he goes and he comes back in. And as he came back into the room, he turned the overhead light on. And suddenly I couldn't see through the curtain anymore and the cockroach didn't seem to be there. So I said, wait, maybe it has dropped down onto the window ledge. I very carefully pull the curtain back. There is no cockroach. What there is the shadow of the window opener that has been against the curtain. So I just tell you this to point out that perceptions cannot be relied upon. And sometimes it's possible for multiple people to be deluded at the same time. So we move on from perceptions to the fourth skandha, the mental formations, thoughts and ideas. And this is, I think, where a lot of us, consciously or unconsciously, we believe that this is where our self resides. We feel that we're smart, we're educated, we value our intellectual abilities and our skills. And that seems to be the essence of me. But of course, that's why we're also terrified of becoming old and demented, because we can't help but see that even these things which we feel like an essential part of us can one day be taken away from us. There's really nothing permanent about our intellectual abilities. And the last group is consciousness itself. Now, consciousness has to be present for any of the last three groups to operate. You have to be conscious to experience feelings and perceptions and thoughts. And yet, just by saying that, it immediately becomes clear that we come in and out of consciousness. We sleep, we wake up. Sometimes we manage to do both in the same period of meditation. And then sometimes we experience longer periods of unconsciousness if we're ill or injured. And if we thought for a moment that the soul resided in consciousness, then we'd have to ask ourselves, does a person who's unconscious or just asleep have a soul? So the Buddha analysed all of these characteristics of human beings, and it was clear to him that in all of those five groups of processes, there's nothing abiding and there's nothing unchanging. And what's more, he made another incredibly valuable observation, that all of these human processes or characteristics are conditioned. That is, they are affected and shaped by the conditions around them. So if we take just one very simple example, if we take the example of a child who's born into a very poor country where there's not enough food, those conditions will affect his body, which is likely to be weak and thin, and they will affect his sensations and his feelings. There'll be gnawing sensations of hunger, and there'll be irritability from hunger. And the child's perceptions will be altered through lack of food. He'll be constantly on the lookout for anything that seems edible. And things will look edible to him that might look very unattractive to us. Maybe food that is spoiled or rotten, he'll still be interested in. His thoughts will circle around food and how to get it. And even his consciousness may be affected. He may have little energy or attention for anything that's not food. And if the food situation gets too bad, he may lose consciousness altogether. But if we change the conditions and the food becomes plentiful again, all the characteristics that make up this child can change too. Yes, there might be some ongoing effects, but generally the change will be dramatic. Now, once he's properly fed, we have a different looking child full of life and energy and vitality and interested in learning and play. This is an incredibly important observation that the Buddha made because it's the foundation of compassion. When we contemplate the nature of our conditioned existence, we realize that only a small part of our lives is a result of our own decisions and actions. We're largely a product of our environment. We didn't choose the genes we're born with, but we had the enormous good fortune to either be born in or be able to come to a country that was wealthy enough to feed all its people and that chose to do so, where everybody could be educated, where we were mostly lucky enough not to be used as cannon fodder by some wealthy and powerful warlord anxious to extend his territory. And when we contemplate these advantages, which are none of our doing, we realize that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to our ancestors and our community, and that we can't afford to judge others who appear to have made poor choices because they too were conditioned by the environment around them, which may not have been nearly as positive as ours. Nagarjuna, who was a great commentator on the suttas, writing in the 2nd century, he summarizes the words of the Buddha when he says, when the idea of an Atman or a soul or a self cease, the notion of mine also ceases. And one becomes free from the idea of I and mine. So just to put that another way, when we give up the idea of an everlasting soul or an ongoing self, however we like to think about it, when we give up the idea that we are separate and different from other beings, then thinking about me and mine becomes pointless because we understand that what we valued and wanted to hold on to in the past, we may no longer need or care about in the present, let alone the future. Now, the interesting thing is, how does this understanding of not self lead to liberation, to freedom of heart and mind? Just excuse me a minute. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this. He says, if you suffer, it's not because things are impermanent. It's because you believe that things ought to be permanent. He says, when a flower dies, you don't suffer much because you understand that flowers are impermanent. But you can't accept the impermanence of your beloved one, and you suffer deeply when she passes away. On the other hand, he said, impermanence makes everything possible. We are often sad and we suffer a lot when things change, but change and impermanence have a positive side. Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. Life itself is possible. If a grain of corn is not impermanent, it can never be transformed into a stalk of corn. And if the stalk of corn were not impermanent, it would never provide us with the ear of corn that we eat. If your daughter is not impermanent, he says, she cannot grow up to be a woman, and then your grandchildren would never manifest. So instead of complaining about impermanence, we should say, warm welcome and long live impermanence. We should be happy when we can see that through the miracle of impermanence, our sadness and suffering will pass. And impermanence should also be understood in the light of interbeing. Because all things all things are locked together. They are constantly influencing each other or conditioning each other, as the Buddha would have said. It's said that a butterfly's wings flapping on one side of the planet can affect the weather on the other side of the planet. Things cannot stay the same because they're influenced by everything else, everything that is not itself. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, if you believe in a permanent self, a self that exists forever, a separate, independent self, your belief cannot be described as Buddhist. When we look more and more deeply at the notions of self, person, living being, and lifespan, we discover that there are no boundaries between self and non-self, between person and non-person. When we take a step on the green earth, we're aware that we're made of sunshine and air, minerals and water, that we're a child of earth and sky, linked to all other beings. This is the practice of non-self. The Buddha invites us to dwell in mindfulness, in the awareness of interbeing, non-self and impermanence. So tonight I want to practice a meditation that has been the one that gives me the best understanding of not self. And at the same time, the most joy from practicing this meditation and from seeing what it feels like to set aside the self for the time being at least. A few weeks ago, Bhante Teja was, the last time he taught on Zoom, he mentioned the Bhikkhuni Patachara, one of the earliest Buddhist nuns and someone who trained many hundreds of Buddhist nuns herself. And her work is featured in this book, which you cannot see on my Zoom, so I'll tell you, it's called The First Buddhist Women, Translations and Commentary on the Writings of the Early Buddhist Nuns by Susan Merker. And the thing that struck me is that these Buddhist women made up stories and poems about their lives. Often they had truly terrible lives. They lost their families in famines and fires and floods. They wrote stories about how they came to meet the Buddha and become a nun, and the kind of practices, meditation practices that they did that led them to enlightenment. And the thing that strikes me about this is that when these early Buddhist women talk about the meditation practices that they do, overwhelmingly they talk about two practices. They don't talk about mindfulness or meditating on the breath. They talk about meditating on the skandhas and the elements. So, and this, they say, is what led them to enlightenment. So tonight we're going to meditate on the elements, the 6 elements: earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And see if you can get the feeling of what it might be like to live without any reliance on the idea of an ongoing self. So this is a longish practice, and it's also a different sort of practice. When we practice mindfulness, we're trying to train our senses to be focused on one thing. And here we're doing the kind of contemplative practice that the Buddha himself practiced a great deal, where we let the mind play over the natural state of things, the way the world works, the dharmas, the natural laws. And we try to figure out what it all means. How do we make sense of it? So make yourself comfortable. And if you feel a bit uncomfortable as we practice, feel free to wriggle a little bit, stretch a little bit, make yourself a bit more comfortable. And then take a deep breath in, let the lungs fill up with air, let it go, and let your eyes close. So we're going to begin our practice by focusing on the earth element. And I want you to imagine that you're sitting outside on a sunny day, sitting on the ground, maybe leaning your back against the comforting strength and solidity of a rock. We're beginning by contemplating the earth element that represents everything solid within us. Bones, teeth, muscles, and hair. So feel the weight and the solidity of the body, the pressure of the body against the ground or whatever it is that you're sitting on. Feeling into the bones. Notice how they give structure to the body, how they enable us to sit upright, to stand. Remembering that our bones and teeth need minerals from the earth to grow. Calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium. Without these minerals, our bones become weak and easily broken. We take in these minerals from the food that we eat, which originally comes from the earth. And what comes from the earth, providing the strength and the solidity in our bodies, ultimately returns to the earth again. A little while back, I read this story about a woman who was a teacher of anatomy to medical students. And she lived on a small farm where she had a great big vegetable garden. And one day she was working on the farm when she discovered a dead fox. And she thought to herself, my students would be interested to see the skeleton of the fox and to notice how it's similar and different to a human skeleton. So she took the body of the fox and to her compost heap, and she put it in the compost heap a foot or two from the top. And she thought, I'll let the compost do its work. I'll come back in a couple of weeks and most of the flesh will probably have been eaten away, and I can clean up the skeleton and take it to show it to my students. So she came back in 3 weeks and she started digging through the compost, looking for the remains of the fox. And there was nothing there. Nothing there but a few teeth. In those 3 weeks, all of the fox had been consumed. The fur, the muscles, the tendons, the bones, just a few teeth left. All of them returned back to the compost, become indistinguishable from the compost, turned back into earth. How long would it take our bodies? 6 weeks? A couple of months? In the right conditions, if it's very dry, the skeleton can last a long time, maybe even become fossilized and become part of the rock itself. But we have to acknowledge in the end that this solid, strong body is not me, is not mine, is not myself. It's built from the earth, and in the end will return to the earth again. And then in your imagination, take a walk away from your rock and find yourself a place to sit by your favorite piece of water. Maybe by the ocean, a river, a creek. And let us contemplate the water element. Maybe you'd even like to wade into the water and float on the water, feeling your body cradled and supported and gently rocked. The water element represents everything fluid within you. And right now you can feel the fluid bathing your eyes behind the eyelids. You can feel the saliva moistening the mouth. You can connect through your imagination with the blood, carrying oxygen and nutrition to every cell in the body. You can imagine the lymph fluid carrying the immune cells to fight infection and heal wounds. You can imagine the cerebral fluid bathing the brain, the spinal fluid carrying messages up and down the spine, the synovial fluid in the joints, which allows us to move so fluidly and gracefully. As much as 70% of our body weight is made up of this water element. It's vital to our being. We can't live long without it. We see this water element in the world around us, the rivers, the streams, and the creeks. ultimately all flowing into the oceans. We're aware of that water from the oceans being evaporated up into the clouds, feeling the humidity in the air on a summer's day, the clouds hanging over us, full and dark, before the rain comes down, cooling and refreshing all the life forms on earth. And where do all these fluids in our body come from? From the water in the streams and the river. Every couple of hours, we're taking in more water. We feel that water flowing down our throats, flowing through us. And when our bodies have used what they need, we pee it out. We sweat it out. We expel moisture with every out-breath, returning this water element to the world. So this water element, 70% of our bodies, is, as the Buddha says, it's not me, it's not mine, it's not myself. It's just borrowed from the universe, and it returns to the universe when we're finished with it. But just for a moment or two, enjoy the water element. Enjoy the feeling of floating on water. Now come out of the water and rest in the warmth of the sun as we contemplate the fire element. The fire element represents the warmth and the energy in our bodies. And just become aware of the warmth where one part of your body rests against another part. The hands together in the lap, the arms close to the body. Allow yourself to stretch a little. If you're feeling a little stiff, or wriggle the toes, pull the chin back in towards the throat, stretch the back of the neck, and feel that energy move through the body. That warmth and energy is life itself. We know that when the body is stiff and cold, then life has passed. Where does that warmth and energy come from? The ancient yogis talked about Agni, the fire of digestion. They envisaged a fire deep down in our bellies, where our food was consumed and turned into warmth and energy that the body could then use. Ultimately, of course, our food comes from the sun. As plants use the warmth and light of the sun to grow, we use that stored sun energy to grow more food, to build shelters and dams for holding water, to build boats and bridges. We use it to solve problems, to create music, stories, images, and wonderful gadgets. Truly, we do amazing things with our fire energy. So amazing that we might be tempted to think, this wonderful thing that I have made, this really represents the best of me. This is how I appear in the world. I'm the artist, the inventor, the composer, the problem solver, the beloved parent nurturing the next generation. But while we rush happily to claim the rewards and the recognition for all of our work, we forget that this energy comes from outside of us. This is the stored energy of the sun, flowing through us, warming us, giving us the energy to do all kinds of things. So we may need to remind ourselves sometimes. This fire element, this warmth and energy, it's not me, it's not mine, it's not myself. This is energy that I have borrowed from the universe, and hopefully I use it for good in the world. And then we move on to the air element. And noticing where the air touches your skin, your face, your hands, any part of the body that's exposed to the air. And just noticing whether the air that's touching your skin is warm or cool, whether it's moving or still. We also notice the air as it enters and leaves the body. Cooler air flowing over the upper lip, through the nasal passages and down the throat, filling the lungs. Warmer air flowing in the opposite direction, moving out of the body. Becoming aware of this meeting between the body and the air element, happening both inside the body and outside the body. The air element surrounds us, and we can feel it on our skin. We feel it entering and leaving the body as we breathe. We experience it as the wind. We see it moving clouds and the leaves of trees. We see it moving grasses and making waves on the surface of water. This same element is inside us, filling our lungs, dissolving into our bloodstream, entering every cell in our body, keeping us alive. Oxygen combines with molecules in the body, becoming part of every cell. And as we reflect in this way, we might recall that the oxygen we breathe has come from plants, as they use the light of the sun to create their own food. Much of the air we're breathing now was made in the rainforests of the world. So as we breathe in the rainforest. The rainforest becomes part of our body. Something that was not us becomes us. And in return, our living and breathing produces carbon dioxide that returns to the rainforest, being absorbed, turning into wood and branches, stems and leaves, fruit and flowers. So the rainforest, in part, is us, made from us. What we call us becomes not us. And the air element in reality never was us. We can't hold on to it. It's just flowing through us. It's borrowed from the universe and it returns to the universe after flowing through us. And then moving to our fifth element, the element of space. So as you sit here, become aware of the space around you. When we're born, pushed out of our mother's body, miraculously, a me-sized space opens up in the world to accommodate us. A space which fluctuates as our bodies grow, becoming larger as we grow taller, larger as we grow fatter or pregnant, shrinking back a little after the baby's born, or if we lose weight. But my space is not just the space, the size of my body. No, we expect a bit more. If you imagine stretching out your arms for a moment, right out to the tip of your fingers, that's about how much space you want. Arm's length all around. If someone came and sat in your lap right now, you'd be pretty annoyed. You'd think that person is invading my personal space. But in reality, we don't have any rights to this space. This space I occupy now was occupied by someone else just a short time ago. Let me take you on a little walk through my neighbourhood. We're going just round the corner to Pyramid Park. Beautiful, spacious park on the edge of Sydney Harbour. The name Pyramid reminds us of the Gadigal people who used to like to come here and collect oysters and mussels off the rocks. They left behind the name and their piles of oyster shells. I'm sure it was one of their favourite places because it has plentiful fresh water, little waterfalls springing out of the cliffs. And the sea is calm and the oysters are easy to find. But when the English settlers came, the Gadigal were pushed out, and many of them died from the smallpox that the settlers brought with them. But the settlers discovered Pyramid in their turn, and it was described in one of the earliest newspapers as a very pleasant place for a picnic. The council have carved that phrase into a bench by the water so that we remember them. We can imagine these early settlers in their uncomfortable clothes, enjoying the sunshine, the fresh air, and the space here. So different from the pollution and crowding of Britain. Throughout the 19th century, this area became very industrialized, and the space was filled with the sugar workers, turning sugar cane into brown sugar, white sugar, golden syrup, and treacle. The sugar workers are gone, but some of the big wooden beams from their factory still remain in the park, advertising 10-pound tins of treacle and 20-pound bags of sugar. When I came to live in Sydney in the 80s, this space was owned by the water police. They kept their boats here. It was all fenced off with a high fence, and the public was not allowed in. There were signs saying, "Keep out." The water police owned this space. But sometime around about 2000, the water police were shunted off to somewhere else, and the council turned this space into a beautiful waterside park. I was coming home in a taxi recently, and I'd been chatting with the taxi driver. And I'd learned that he was a Syrian refugee, and he'd spent a number of years on Manus, but had finally managed to get out, get to Sydney, and bring his wife and 2 little girls here. He said the best thing about Australia was that you weren't being shot at all the time. There was some roadwork happening just as we got to the park, so we were held up for a bit. But he was very interested in the park and was asking me all kinds of questions about it. Were those barbecues? Were they free? See, the children's playground is over there. Yes, that's free too, open to anyone. As we moved off, he said that he was going to bring his family here on Sunday for a picnic. And it gave me quite a lot of pleasure to think that this space, which has been owned by so many different people over the last 2 centuries, would for a little while on the weekend be possessed by this man and his family. Whatever space we think we own in this world, the space of our houses, our apartments, our gardens, we can be sure that someone else was there before us and that someone else will be along as soon as we move on. And then we come to our last element, the element of consciousness. Consciousness is the process by which we take all of the sensory input that we get, all the sights and sounds and smells, the feeling of things that brush against the skin, and the feelings that arise from those sensory experiences of liking or disliking. And we try to make sense of it all and weave it all together into the story of our lives. Consciousness creates for us the story of who we are, why we are the way we are, and in what ways we're unique. We tend to think that consciousness is our self, and that as a species, we have a very special form of consciousness, much superior to other life forms. We're only just starting to discover that although some aspects of our consciousness are highly developed, other life forms can outdo us in some ways. We know, for instance, that animals are much better than us at predicting changes in the weather. That birds and turtles have amazing navigational abilities that let them cross the globe, coming each time exactly to the spot where they want to be, without benefit of any navigational aids. Lately, we've discovered that trees, who we didn't think were conscious at all, can detect when the trees growing near them are struggling and can share nutrition with them through the vast fungal web that grows beneath the surface of the earth. Our consciousness may be special in many ways, but it's not always reliable. It relies on the input we get from sense data, what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. And that is limited by the particular body that we're in. And it changes as we age. At any point in our lives, we may have a strong, accurate sense of sight or hearing, or we may have poor sight or be partially deaf. So we might get inaccurate information from our senses, or we might not. Some senses might be missing. A young person may have very sharp senses, but lack the experience to know what the data means. An older person may have gaps in the data because their senses are failing, but is better able to fill in the gaps from past experience. So individual consciousness may be unique, but not be very reliable. Consciousness works better when it is shared. Through sharing, we get more sources of data, and we can test our own understanding against others' interpretation. We're only at the very beginning of understanding what we might learn about the consciousness of other species. Our particular interpretation of the world is constantly changing. Sensations and feelings and thoughts coming and going and being shaped by our awareness and our experiences. So we tend to think of ourselves as separate from the rest of the world. But reflecting in this way, we can see that we're intimately connected through the great web of life, invisibly connected with all living things, part of the great cycle of elements as we borrow and return the elements of earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. Take a final moment to just sit appreciating this miraculous world we're part of, appreciating a sense of interconnectedness, appreciating ourselves as intimately connected with all life. We are just one expression of the amazing life force on earth. We are that life force becoming conscious. Then let your awareness come back to the room with your eyes open. So I would welcome any comments or questions about not self or about that particular practice. I hope you like it. I've been doing it now for a number of years, and I do it about once a month. And as I said, it really brings me a great deal of joy to feel that connection to all other forms of life. But over to you. Do you have anything to say about it?
Everyone, feel free to unmute yourself and participate in these discussions. Anything that your thoughts about no self and anything that you would like to ask Sue. Beautiful meditation, Sue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meredith.
May I ask you something?
Yes, Bill. Yeah.
Yeah. Regarding when we pass, if we are burned, are we depriving the compost heap, so to say, of nutrition?
Yeah.
Look, I'm not the world's greatest gardener, but I do believe that the earth needs charcoal and charred stuff just as much as it needs, fresh compost. I know that some farmers are bringing in burnt substances, and ploughing them into their fields because that's particularly nutritious. So no, I don't think so, Bill. I think either way.
Good.
Yeah.
I was so taken when I read that story of the fox
Yes.
that I thought I would really like to be composted myself. I must see if this is possible. And so I did some searching on the web and I discovered that it's possible in some places overseas, but it's not yet possible in Australia. So I think we should work on that one. Of course, I'd be very happy to, go back and feed a few more trees.
Yes.
Yes.
I've had a friend recently who was buried underneath a tree.
Yes, that's a very nice
Oh,
place.
his ashes were put under the tree, yes.
Yes.
Uh,
Did he own the land, or was it the land owned by?
no, it's in a cemetery, but it's something for his loved ones to go and they go there and
Yes.
beam in the tree.
Excellent.
So when you talk about consciousness, it's also impermanent, but there are some teachings about when you talk about consciousness, that consciousness is supposed to be eternal, isn't it? I mean, the form can dissolve, but the consciousness it's always there. It's different type of consciousness.
Yeah, no, it's not always there though, Meredith. I look, in Hinduism, they believe that there is permanent consciousness, and that the Atman, which is really the consciousness, continues unchanged. But I think that's exactly what the Buddha was saying, that he could not find anything unchanging. That everything is fluctuating, everything is in flow. And some in the suttas, people say, well, what gets carried over to the next life? And the answer that's given is, well, it's like stopping anything, midway through. It's different from when it started, and it will continue to change. But I'm not explaining this very well. Partly because it's my personal belief that we don't get reborn as the individual that we were at the moment of death, but that we continue to be reborn throughout our lives, And at the moment, every time, for instance, you have an interaction with someone which causes a profound transformation in them, that is like a kind of rebirth. So if you think, for instance, of the teachers you have met, and some of them, I'm sure, have changed your life. They have given you skills that have allowed you to do things that you otherwise would not be able to do, or they have caused you to transform the way you look at things, then that is a kind of rebirth. You know, you are a different person from the person that you would have been if you had never met that teacher. And it's not only teachers, you know, it's people that you care about, people that you have all kinds of interactions with that can make those changes in you. So I think we are reborn in many ways. You know, we're reborn throughout our life, and then at the time of death, I think our bodies break up into all of those molecules and are reborn in all kinds of different lives. Some of them are reborn as, some part of us is reborn as a tree that our body is now nourishing underground. Some of us, you know, may be eaten by insects, and so it goes on. And gradually we make our way up the food chain, our molecules, until we're, after several lives, we're reborn as a human being again.
Yeah.
I remember Thich Nhat Hanh before he died, when he could still speak. He was at a retreat with his students, and they were taking a break from meditation. It must have been lunchtime. They were sitting around under a tree. And the students were saying to him, Tay, what do you think you will be reborn as in your next life? This great teacher who many people thought, you know, was the greatest living teacher of his generation. And they would, the students were kind of thinking, what could be more impressive than what he is now? And Tay said, you see that tree above you? That will be me. One day you'll be here and I'll be gone, but you'll be here under a tree, and the tree will be sheltering you from the sun. And you'll think, that is Tay, he's still here with me. So, you know, I kind of believe that Thich Nhat Hanh felt the same way about rebirth as I do. That it's not like we have a whole unique personality that goes on to the next life, but that we distributed through many of the lives that we affect through our own lifetime, and through the lives that we go on to nourish after we're dead.
In one of Thich Nhat Hanh's talks, he also said, when I'm cremated, some of the moisture within my body will evaporate and go up into the air and become a cloud. Yep. So eventually that cloud will form rain. One of those drops might fall on your head, so I'll still be with you.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
It's beautiful, Bill. Thanks for sharing that.
So I find all your teachings on impermanence really helpful. The thing that keeps tripping me up is, what is it which is subject to karma? If there is no permanent self, I get stuck there somehow.
Yeah. Well, as it has happened, Carolyn, I had a bit in this talk on what happens to karma and where is the self that inherits the karma. And I thought maybe that's a bit much for tonight, so I took it out. But right. I'm happy to tell you. The Buddha said, you know, you can think of it as the tragedy of karma is that the person who inherits the karma is not the same person as the one who created it.
That's terribly unfair.
It is terribly unfair. But the thing about Buddhism is it is brutally realistic, and it's not trying to fool you that, you know, things are always fair. because what is the example that he gives? Oh, one of the examples that he gives is Angulimala. I don't know if you remember Angulimala, but he was a serial killer way back in the time of the Buddha. He was a gangster kind of person who had a necklace of finger bones he had taken from all of the people that he'd killed. And so, as you can imagine, you know, the population was extremely anxious to get rid of him. But one day, the Angulimala encounters the Buddha walking in the forest, and he thinks, okay, this could be my next victim. And he starts to track him. And Vincent, and he is tracking after the Buddha, and the Buddha seems to be speeding up. And no matter how fast Angulimala walks, he can't catch up with the Buddha. And he calls out, wait, stop, you know. And the Buddha turns to him and says, I have stopped, Angulimala, have you? Meaning, you know, I am the one who's, I have stopped desiring and trying to make this world fit my, my desires. So Angulimala is so taken with this that he decides to join the Buddha and learn more, and he becomes a monk, and he gives up his terribly evil ways. But he goes out with the monks on alms round. However, the villagers have not forgotten, and when they see Angulimala in amongst the Buddha's disciples, they are outraged. And any time he appears on alms round, they chuck rocks at him and chase him, and he has to run back to the Buddha's settlement. And he goes to the Buddha and he says, what can I do? You know, they hate me. They don't believe that I've changed. And the Buddha says, bear it, Angulimala. This is your karma manifesting. So that is the tragic bit. And the other thing that you have used to illustrate that is, you might remember a few years back that when the Bali 9 Australians were captured in Bali, transporting a whole lot of drugs. I forget now whether they were transporting them in or out, but anyway, they were caught. And they were imprisoned. And the two who were considered to be the ringleaders, they were in jail for something like 8 years. And in that time, all of the people who worked in the jail agreed that they had made very considerable efforts to improve themselves, to help their fellow prisoners. They had set up, you know, counselling groups. They had set up art therapy groups. They had really changed their complete way of being. After 8 years or so, though, their cases finally got through the Indonesian courts, and they were condemned to death. And their lawyer said, look, these are two completely different men from the men who committed this crime. But that's the thing about karma, is, you know, we are all changing all the time. And we may have already decided that we were wrong to do what we did, and we should change, and we do change, but karma may still come back to bite us.
Thank you. That's
because karma, it's not like in the Christian tradition where God is up there in the sky deciding you deserve to be punished, you know, and you don't.
No, it's consequences.
Karma is just the consequences of your action.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Anyone else who would like to share?
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Frank.
If I may recall an experience, what Buddha Dhamma wise man's ferry. Ayakema was the teacher, and 10-day retreat. In the first 5 days, I was struggling, couldn't sit, And I thought, because of my work, I'm used to walking. So I said, all right, this morning I do 2 hours of walking meditation without stopping. And after 1.5 hours, I realized really that the body is not me. I couldn't lift feet. It felt like 100 weight. And I was swaying, and there was no wind like the water. It was the greatest experience about Anatta for me. It affected in the beginning the body, but then after also the mind. So we can learn and we can achieve things like that about Anatta. But it was a hell of a work. I mean, 2 hours non-stop, 21 steps there in the forest and back. Never forget that experience. And it really made me happy. Even now, when I think of it, that I don't have to worry about this 80-year-old body because it will go anyway. But the only question is about consciousness. I'm not too clear about consciousness as an element. Probably the first time I heard consciousness as an element next to water, earth, etc. Maybe a few more words if you don't mind saying about.
In the elements appear in a lot of ancient cultures, and they're used to describe what people think are the absolute fundamental unchanging elements that might make up a living being. So, and they are really the descriptions used by the very early scientists back in the days of the Buddha. When they talk about earth, water, fire, and air, they're talking about certain properties in the body. And today we have more sophisticated scientific names for them, but they're still talking about the same things, really. Mass and heat and gases and so forth. And then the Buddhists added a couple of others, space and consciousness. And I think those two only turn up in Buddhism. And they are can be a bit hard to get your head around. But when you think about it, all of us we can't avoid occupying a certain amount of space in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. And consciousness seems like it could be the place where our true self resides, because it's intimately connected with our mind and our thoughts and our memories and our plans and all of those things that seem to make us unique, but which are not permanent, coming and going. Yeah. Is that about the best I can do, Frank? Is that?
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, if I may ask one question, if we have time. Coming Sunday, I have a charity afternoon collecting money for the Ukrainian refugees. And we have a Hungarian bodhisattva, a bodhisattva. His name was Alexander Toma Körös. He was from Transylvania, a Hungarian. He spoke 20 languages, and he created the first Tibetan English dictionary. And he wrote the first book, The Buddha's Teaching and Life, in English. Of course, his English was 100%. So can you say a few words about who is a bodhisattva? Last week, I think you mentioned that the Bodhisattva, if he looks around the world, very rarely can be happy. Was it like that? I remember well.
Yes. A bodhisattva is someone who has decided that he will hold off on his own enlightenment in order to assist other beings to come to enlightenment and to freedom.
Yes.
And so, but the point that Susan Murphy Roshi, who's a Zen teacher in Sydney, the point that she made was that it's all very well being a bodhisattva, but if the bodhisattva opens his or her heart to the cries of the world, Kuan Yin is a bodhisattva, and her name means the one who hears the cries of the world. So if you're opening your heart to all of the pain and suffering in the world, you can't expect to be happy all the time. You know, sometimes it's going to hurt.
Yes, thanks.
I never heard of your Hungarian bodhisattva, Frank, but that's really interesting.
Now, he opened up the heart of the West of Europe to the Buddha's teaching and to especially to the Tibetan. He was a real hero. In 1932, the biggest Tokyo University made a statue of him, and they called him a Bodhisattva. So I'm very proud of him.
Yeah.
And this Sunday, I'll have to talk about the work of this man, because collecting some money after dinner, etc. I'm working hard on it.
Well done, Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done, Frank. Right, so
Okay.
tonight we have to thank Sue for giving us such an insightful thought. There's a lot of things that we have to ponder after the talk. So thank you so much, Sue.